Hello. Today I would love to work with you on the Prelude and Fugue in E-flat minor, D-sharp minor between the Prelude and the Fugue. The only harmonically spelled out of 48 by Bach in this first volume of 1722. On the piano, the chords release the fragrances of their substances in dissonances and consonances by arpeggiations, which also delay the important notes that you want to mention. So the quality of the expression is not only in the spreading, but also in the delaying that the spreading projects in terms of expression. When, let's say, you harp-like display the chord of the relative major, and then when you have a landing on a chromaticism, from the Greek color, chromatics, chroma, but often associated in minor because of the lament mood, when technically, since it's all semitones, a chromatic scale should be genderless, but it is minor more than major. And in a post-romantic era sense of classical music, we associate minor to sadness and happiness to major or hope, like when we finish a minor piece in a Picardy third, region of North France. I don't know why related to finishing in major, but it was mostly about the beating of the resonance of the waves of the harmonics, that in a resonant choral or organ in a resonant church acoustic gives a clarity of the ending of the last chord with a major third instead of the minor that carried waves of non-clean, clear consonants. And I don't think it was related to major, but because of the post-romantic era in which we are, compared to the Baroque era that came after the Renaissance for them, Bach is looking at the Renaissance to write fugues, which today are austere, but for then represented the virtuosity by not polyphony, yes, but not by finger polyphony, but voice polyphony, hearing, organizing the voices, more like a writer of crossword puzzles rather than of novels, like an aria recitativo or a fugue is a different style, genre rather. And major minor, virtuosity of fingers compared to virtuosity of lines in terms of voice leading. All these elements are to do with how we project ourselves in the music of the past, of our own present time. And in Bach's time, the fugue was already Richard Carr of the past. This music that even in his late years, around 1750, was considered austere and passé, so to say, in terms of fashion. And more music that represents other musics, like speaking in analogies, is the same thing playing on the piano an aria, or the keyboard playing a dance for a suite, was also an analogy. But not pure music, which the fugue is and the sonata form first movement is, where you develop concepts and aspects of things that you can't really express in words, because if not, you wouldn't need the universal language of music, sort of a Latin that connects, let's say, medical doctors from all over the world, because they learn most of the medical terminology of let's say, diseases or body parts in Latin, at least they used to. So if they meet at the International Congress, they speak Latin, not because they can take a beer in Latin together in the bar after, but because they speak about the search interest that they know and they have that is to do with their area of research, and therefore they have a common language that is not spoken but it's written and that they think in. So it creates a sense like the tonal system, you would say, is a little bit of a Latin of musicians, because it's sort of the grammar that is common through different geographies and time periods within, let's say, 3 centuries between before Bach and till Ravel, while it remains and adapted to different styles, language, musically, and even spoken or written. So it's like an evolving literature style using common roots that you can relate to. And when Bach writes his fugues, he thinks voice leading as naturally as Chopin thinks fingering. And he goes. So is it because his keyboards had instruments like harpsichord or organ with multiple manuals? Or is it because he was taught to learn as he did, study in order to inspire his understanding of music, motets of the Renaissance? Because most of the fugues are sung. And most of the rhythmic patterns are in the preludes. That's why I said most, because there are the exceptions. That's a fugue that goes in 30 seconds for the expression of speed, which is more finger-wise compared to the singing fugues. And you have preludes that go for the fingers, quick arpeggiations, or the aria-like genre. And in the case of the E-flat minor, despite the arpeggiation of these slow releasing fragrance chordal elements, creating moods more than atmospheres or perhaps colors according to some teachers. Everybody has a different way to refer to music in their own analogy. Could be also bittersweet like taste. Could be dissonance and consonance, colors or shades, dark and bright, chiaroscuro. Or just what it is, which is a dissonance, a tension, a release, a dissonant instrument tuning, of course, that's also part of the expression of the day, homogenized in the well-tempered in order to play in each key, compared to the mean tuning of before in Bach's youth. But still you have leaps of dissonant intervals, like diminished thirds, appoggiaturas under and above, elliptically around. Or leaps of tritons that command a certain articulation separation rather than a smoothness for a tension release of, let's say, suspension. And then the inevitable punctuations. Where do I go? How do I go? How do I go further with the deceptive that has the tonic to the dominant to the tonic in the melody, and you think is conclusive, but if the bass is harmonized on the 6th degree, then you delay. And the art of delaying the ending is basically like starting at birth to die, except you're not aware of it, hopefully, obviously, but you are. And in a way, when you start the piece, you're almost done. But the reason that you're not done is because you want to explore through storytelling, harmonic exaggerations of some specific secondary degrees that are more brought up, like these cousins compared to these uncles, and some purposely secondary, in this case, foreign degrees that are altered degrees, like flat 2 for the first inversion, Neapolitan 6th. So in fact, the prelude is there to establish the tonalities, like as to say, this is, I'm king in my domain, and the fugue will blossom on this prelude, and I set, so to say, the musical landscape or soundscape for the ear. So you could just play that and then start the fugue. Obviously, besides the tonic, you try the subdominant, the fifth under in the circle of fifths, or in the scale, the note under the dominant, to establish one relative, the main relative, the dominant, who determines the tonality, like sort of the mother, and then the leading tone, the child that, another analogy, perhaps cheap as it is, but it comes spontaneously to me naturally. The leading tone is calling for the tonic, the father, and the dominant is holding all of them together because it has in its womb the third, which is the leading tone, and in the seventh, the other third of the chord, the triton that locks by the diminished third, the closing into the tonic. In other words, the tension release system is locked by the dominant. And so you establish yourself, like here in the first bar, the tonic, the subdominant, the dominant with the leading tone on the ostinato of the tonic. And the reason the ostinato in the beginning is there is also because Bach is a Baroque composer where the melodic notes that come out as emanations, as consequences to the bass melodic root, melodic line, melodic root line, the continuo, the continuum, the walking bass. Then you have a melody with escaped notes. Then he goes dropping, but he could have gone. So melodically, the right hand has sort of embryos of melodic expressions which in the Romantic era of the 19th century, let's say Chopin, emphasizes more, and then the harmony comes after. So the melody hangs on the air as essential melodic, thematic, moody, expressive material that incorporates the tension and the tritone. It's not like the harmony and the melody, the walking bass and the voice leading and the organization of layered polyphony. It's polyphonic but harmonized. So you have these chordal extractions that are in fact the composite of the melodic voicing. And here you can do a ballad, the opening of the prelude, when in fact it's rooted down up from the bass note, harmonization wise, the top note sort of becomes the, another analogy, the steam from the chimney, creating a cloud that is puffy or dark on top of the sky, into the sky, obviously, on top of the chimney. And the chimney is the root or the base. And it's the rapport between the highest note or escaped higher note possible emanating from the root note that creates a sense of expression. First is on the E flat tonic ostinato, the third, fifth, the 10th, dropped to the 6th, dropped to the leading tone, creating a dissonance, which it is with the leading tones and the tonic. So the tensions have to be released, sometimes delay release. The dotted rhythm delays the delay of the release. But then there are arpeggiation, as I mentioned earlier. Delays the melody, because if not, you would do instead of. So you cannot not delay it, but then you also melodically betray the rhythmicity of the short long becoming long long, since you have to add inside the delayed displayed chord. There are many of these contradictions and discrepancies like this about the delaying while implementing the chordal richness. Is also to do with the fact that he writes very long held notes that are not arpeggiated, that are not trilled or ornamented with a mordent, which is a repetitive way of trilling. In the Monteverdi Italian opera days, or before, in the early days of opera, the expression was to staccato on the note, when you wanted to stress something meaningful, not The trill came later, because originally anyway there was a vibrato when you sing naturally. And that, on the piano or the harpsichord, is obviously not a practical action-wise device. So you bite on the note next to it, mordre or mordent, which in Latin, French, roots from Latin to French, mordent, or from Italian too, coming also from Latin, means biting. So you bite the next note. And so you say, yes, there is embellishment that allows to prolong the leading tone D from a decay, and then, since you implement by the values like half notes in this case, that the tempo is not very fast. Also because of the mood of the minor, even if it's relatively less meaningful than in romantic music. And little by little you deduce that this cannot be. Or it could, but it's not, at least I think, and most of us assume. So if you enter in a daydream, more or less bittersweet or sad or lament, whatever you want to put words, again, all words are cheesy when you have to describe something that cannot be described since it has to be played. But by playing it, you create a mood that you can define for yourself, perhaps as a listener silently. You don't have to express it, except when you teach. But then it's belittling it by just naming it, because, by the way, it's bigger and more meaningful than the given meanings of the chosen words, which are reductive in a certain way. But they're descriptive while being reductive, as is the case of all lost in translation situations. And so when he finishes, let's say, he knows that the melodic line or the B flat dies, and then he delays by writing a very elaborate inserted middle voice to the minor ninth, creating that dissonance on which Chopin would dwell expressively and Bach impressively, meaning inside. So inside that by the time that B flat is heard and A comes, the B flat has died. So it's not even something you can argue, because in the G minor prelude, in 4/4, he writes a trill for the whole note in both hands, in the relative major. And here in an equivalent whole note, in an equivalent slow tempo, or at least values more than tempo that determine a certain, let's say, pace of the slow tempo, you see, he didn't write a trill. So what does he do? He indicates to the listener, remember that B flat is 4/3, suspension to the leading tone and tonic in the dominant key. tracking it, then you only follow the one that moves. As I like to say, fugues played by solo violinists arpeggiate everything all the time. So the battle for the length of sound in terms of the voice leading understanding is when does a voice fade, when does another voice overtake, and how the two voices, like let's say fishes in a fish tank, glide around in a certain choreography without to collide. And all composers who wrote fugues after Bach seem to have used it more for the collision characteristic, like Beethoven in fugues or sonatas or quartet, and so on. Schubert in the Fantasy F minor for four hands, or so many things. The fugue comes, or the Liszt development of the sonata for piano. The fugue becomes, of course, bowing to the old style, sort of the neoclassical aspect of every era, because the fugue represents sort of the brain of music compared to, let's say, the aria, the heart, and let's say the virtuosity, the feet, or the physicality of it, like the jigs or the rondo finales, which all satisfy different levels of psyche for the musician and their audience. And often the sonata form sort of incorporates a bit of dance, a bit of singing, canta baila, like the Spanish would say, and do say. And the sonata form, which is the pure music by itself, just two opposite characters of possible opposition, more or less, for the two themes, and then developing them to reunite them in the original key. So there are concepts rather than moods in the sonata form, first movement, two themes, and the monotheme self-developed fugue that comes from a single cell, like cloning, that is obviously another way of intellectually organizing the thoughts. And when the composers write fugues after Bach, it seems to be always a demonstration either of the peak of their knowledge, like at the end of a Brahms piano quintet. It's sort of like the crowning moment where all the voice leading organization or sort of jubilation of voices rises and transcends to a level that the simple aria, is beautiful, meaningful, and probably emotionally touching as it is, can't do. Or does it at a different intimate level, like Ravel, the slow movement of the G concerto in E, uses the accompaniment with bass and intervals for the aria, which is very neo-Baroque. Concerto by Bach slow movement, using the same pattern. So for the slow aria. But fugue is its own world, and in a way the preludes, as different as they are through the 48 that he wrote in 2 books, are all establishing the tonality for the fugue, but how? Very few are also horizontal polyphonic, like E major book 2. Sonata 3, trio sonata, with inversion of the voices, who was under is above, and etc. So you would think that the fugue in large values, which already Caspar Fischer wrote in his earlier than well-tempered clavier Bach's time, Ariadne Musicae, but that's a parenthesis that Bach didn't steal it, probably copied it. Surely, but also developed it, powered it. But already in Caspar Fischer and in Bach after, it has the vocal aspect of the fugue with the long values. That is like the motet. It could be considered like Kyrie eleison, Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata eleison. I'm just making gibberish Latin. Mass for the Catholic faith in that language usage, as Bach did his B minor Mass, right, for the Dresden audition, which unfortunately and strangely he failed. I mean, when you fail to get a job with a B minor Mass, it's sort of, thankfully not many people remember this anecdote because it's sort of depressive or demonstrative of the eternal consistency of injustice in the society. But nevertheless, that is another digression of so many of mine, that my arborescent thought process often zigzags away from the main point. But that's why I'm not an academic teacher. I'm a sort of loud voice, subconscious expressing thoughts teacher, and how the composer thought of it, and perhaps how it could have been if it wasn't, in order to play better like it is, of course. That is the main point. I don't want there to be any misunderstanding, because even if I can say that major and minor don't mean much in Baroque compared to Romantic, which is obviously laughable, or there is no funeral march in major for obvious reasons, whatever the secondary levels of irony could be placed in that. There is the fact that if the prelude was in major, you wouldn't have that subtlety of the variety of minor modes. Ascending, descending, harmonic, colliding, or using like... descending motion for the ascending melodic on the minor sixth, which is the natural part of the minor in E flat minor, A flat minor in this case. The chromaticism that come from the subtlety of superposing different versions of minors that exist make it contradictory and beautiful and chromatically and subtle, and in fact innuendoed. It's the opposite of the binary major, which is relatively simplistic in terms of harmonic language. Not relatively, completely simplistic. It's just there. It's blunt rather than simplistic. Perhaps it's the rather more correct word I would like to use. If only knew how to speak all my thoughts in the right words, that would be a writer. I'm neither though that either. But blunt is the word. I mean, it's obvious in a way also. And then when you play minor, immediately you have parts of major in the ascending, descending, but in the bottom remains minor. So the third minor, the major, sixth minor. So Bach incorporates in the subtlety of the superpositions of choosing passing tones that collide or expressively rub, delaying. It gives this E flat minor prelude a sense of elegance, ambiguity, subtlety, innuendo, arpeggiation that suggests something voluptuous, almost sensorily speaking, as well as a whole section of the piece that is devoted to a two-voice intervals, like tritone, tough intervals in terms of dissonance, tension without release, almost build-ups, compared to the arpeggiated and aria on top. So he explores these subtleties and contradictions within the same piece, but because in a way he throws a lot of different ways of touching the keyboard, the toccata, toccare from the Italian touch, or the Latin, of course, again. All goes back to that. So the modern piano, with already the battle of the length of sound being won, compared to the necessity or beauty of the trill, or the non-necessity of trill, even if the note dies, because that's what Bach does, and not as a necessity to prolong the note. Here you have already on the piano the capacity to play legato, but if it's a leap of a tritone, then you don't want it to sound slurred, because it would belittle the hardness of that interval, and you would like to keep it for a slur for a minor second and not for a diminished fifth or for a major sixth. And then so these little spacings that you would put, is little interstices, openings in your articulation, which on the piano, because of the overwhelming length of sound compared to the harpsichord, if we can compare that for that, since the instrument is based on the dynamics contrast for expression, forte piano in the name of the instrument. I don't know why people kept only the piano part to call it, but nevertheless, on the harpsichord, it's mostly about the articulation, not because you don't have dynamics, since you don't know what you're missing, because you don't miss it not having it, but you express yourself fully through what you do. And what you do is dissonance, delay, or voice imitation of some, or bowed imitation, or bowed imitation of the voice singing imitated on the harpsichord. In other words, it's like as if the keyboard instrument in Baroque is the proxy for the other genres, the dance, the song, the aria and the partita for the dances. And the fugue is the translation on the keyboard of the motets with a long voice of sung Latin words in that say most of the case. Christe eleison. So you hear the fugue, in this case D sharp minor, in more even values rhythmically, so more calm in terms it's not that is devoted to the prelude to establish a tonality with dotted rhythms, with leaps of tenths, with displayed chords of expected secondary dominance or unexpected secondary dominance. Introducing this amount again of minor mode chromaticisms, which beyond the color created tension and a release, pain, or an evocation of a sense of pain. And when he finishes the vegetativo section, elliptically turning around with a minor diminished third instead of and the real note, the B flat, the dominant and the tonic, comes as syncopated release at the end of the syncopation. So in fact the real note is barely heard in terms of value, because you stay manipulatively, psychologically on that tension that even the sound cannot prolong, but you know you cannot stop there until you bring it to a closure, to the tension's release. And you should finish, or in major, and in this case before he finishes, way before, he delays tactics with the deceptive, well called in English, cadence, cadence rompue in French, which means broken cadence. But deceptive is so much more explicit for what it is, because it would have finished if it wasn't harmonized in a way to delay the art of delaying the tonic from which you started. So in a way, the first chord is the last, and then you have the fugue already inside this triad, in terms of the interval that he uses. But of course, you display so many things, so different touches, different modulations, some expressive, surprising, dynamically, but through the chromaticism or the leaps and all the effects that you can use, or you need rather to use, in order to express a sense of sorrow, dropping pain, intervals-wise. All of them can be associated to symbolism of human nature or religious nature, of a desire to elevate the spirit while the human condition drops us down. And it's in a way simplistic, and in a way it is true too, to say that there is a lot of gestural interval-wise expression in Bach's music that is not just pure music, because he also does in the preludes often, and sometimes in the fugues, if we want to think of the intervals as such, they do have their expression, like the opening of this interval in the fugue is an interval, meaning melodic leap, compared to the same in the, be it arpeggiated but chordal, in the prelude's first note. So you play this in the prelude and this in the fugue, which is answered by this. The tonal answer being within the 8, 5, 4, the quint, the 5th, by the quart, the 4th in Latin. The mutation of the subject in the answer. I said earlier, the fugue, it is true, could be considered again in a symbolic way to be a bit of a cloning of a cell, which is this, rather than a second theme later in Haydn. This is the same, but slightly different because of the tonal answer to the subject, which we don't call a theme in that terminology, the answer. And then the combinations that they create among themselves when they're accompanied by the next voice entrance with the contra subject that is played while they are displayed. It's so important to sing one, play the other, write both, even from memory, like my teacher taught me before even to play them once a week. New prelude and fugue a week. I was challenging but exciting when I was thirsty, and that was plenty of ocean to drink at an early age. The middle voice is like following, let's say, the second violin or the viola when you listen to a string quartet, where homogenized four instruments, colored in terms of timbres, instruments blend, and you still have to hear them how they, a bit like the little fishes in the tank analogy, you get at some point to be mesmerized by their movements. Perhaps you lose the track of it, and then you just memorize some positions and patterns. So you sort of harmonize the fugue to understand it, because that's how you put the two hands on the piano when you start to think how they fit. And that sort of belittles the whole point of the layered hearing, not only playing, thinking, not only composing, improvising, not only faking the improvisation from the written notes, but coming to the point to which you can follow each of the voices in their entire ecosystem, not separated, but independently connected in a symphony, which comes from the Greek symphonos, in agreement. And I think that once you manage to write them, play them, sing them, hear them, or sing, write, rather sing, play, well, you can write and sing too if you want, but it's a bit far-fetched. At least sing, play, it's already a lot, because then you dissociate the voicings from the fingers, in terms of the fact that you would only play then two voices easily, because you have two hands, one brain. You can get it easily how it's obvious. But then when you have 3 or 4 or 5, let's say, voices, let's say even 3, in this case of this fugue has only 3 only, beautifully 3, not only, then at some point inevitably you share the middle voice between the two hands because of the stretches. So just the industry of playing it on the given keyboard, if it's one keyboard, and Bach had several, so he supposedly organized himself to play on some combination of keyboards at the same time. But basically, whichever way, you have to think the voices independently of the fingers that play them, and then apply fingers that correspond to what you've heard of the voices that you have learned in the first place, independently of having played them. It's why Mademoiselle Boulanger asked me to write them from memory before I play them. And then when I play them, I have to respond to my choosing of fingerings in order, or organization of combination of fingerings, how to follow the middle voice, even if shared between two hands with one brain. It becomes a bit complicated if really applied, because it's not complicated if faked. If one just, like Bach very often uses, even in close proximity, crossing relations of voices. You can, on paper, when you see it, understand it, but when you play it, and because you play a percussive instrument, in denial, as all pianists we are, that it is, but the length of sound allows us to think that we can sing it without the vibrato and without the words. So we're sort of like make-believers, imitating, in fact, the vocal tradition of the motets of Thales, of Orlando di Lasso, or of so many, like Thomas Luis de Vittoria, of Os Omnes, or some beautiful masses by William Byrd, like the Mass in 4 parts. You're in the continuity of this stile antiquo, already antique style for Bach's time, imitating it on the harpsichord, which even had shorter decay than the modern piano, which of course he was not aware of. Obviously, that goes without to say. I'm sorry for that digression to my easy chronology dysfunctionality. But nevertheless, for Bach's time, yes, Byrd was before. How much he knew of him, that's another story, but in terms of his works, but transmission of knowledge of the past in the past was very different from today, where we have so much more information, thankfully. Or perhaps so much that we don't produce so much music of the day, for people of today, and we conserve it in the conservatories so that the tradition of the past is passed to the generations of the next. That's another philosophical topic I'm not going to touch, but it is a side thought, because we are here in presence of a timelessness between a composer who writes it at some point of the time, which happens to be middle 1700s, evocative in the fugue of some 16th century, played on a piano with people who have played 19th and 20th century music, or played in real time, even in same repertoire recital, a little of this, a little of that, or jury or judging competition repertoire. So we played more like flowers in a bouquet, a rose and a lily and a different type of rose. Oh, they look nice together, not possibly belonging together, but we put them in together. And so it becomes our creativity, and why not? Since we played on the later than their instrument, on later than their ears, or if a hearing that is no more exercised by composing because it's separated from interpretation, which it used not to be. And the very learning process of the music from the roots harmonically, melodically up into the voice leading and the virtuosity of the voice leading polyphony is reduced to chordal melodic with accompaniment, or more or less that, less than more, as it advances in time, where it becomes Stravinsky's Sacre du Printemps all in one, like Beethoven already in the Waldstein, where chordal, melodic, rhythmic, it's all one. Sort of like a contraction that becomes almost violently, perhaps part of its time. Violent times call for violent music. And I think that the cruelty of the times of Renaissance and Middle Age were terrible in their own way. Nothing but to think of all these battles. But thankfully we don't commemorate much of their battles other than in history studies, but in museums their artworks, sort of the parenthesis between the battles, where they created beauty that is timeless, regardless of the genre and the style, but it's meaningful to us. Of course, we don't confuse a pyramid with a skyscraper, but it's still architect marvel by itself. It's human nature's intellect to defy gravity and rise high, whichever level of height between a pyramid, the Eiffel Tower, or the Twin Towers and so on, or the rockets going even higher than the towers into space and defying all what our human condition is symbolically by the gravity. While our spirit may elevate itself in a spiritual way, obviously, our body and our senses and our humanity perhaps pushes us down, and it's beautifully so, because we wouldn't be human if not. Humanity is the beauty of the imperfection. To a certain extent, the fugue is the search for a certain perfection, where you don't have a voice that accompanies the other. They all are equal, differently positioned, and Bach uses them so beautifully in the sense that they don't fight. For instance, when he does several of his so-called strettas, I just make it up on the spot for a second, but is to give an example of this extension, we call augmentation of the values of the theme compared to, let's say, the diminution or superpositions, and we call it stretto in Italian, because it comes from narrow in Italian. That means that you narrow your thoughts, and all of a sudden they collide the thoughts, and you superimpose them like a sandwich, and all of a sudden the slowly displayed voice by voice fugue exposition, didactically saying this is 2 now, now 3, and then I'm gonna start overlapping them. That very fact creates, I would say, not rhythmic in this case or harmonic, but perhaps polyphonic accelerando or polyphonic punctuation. It's difficult to know because, in fact, the voice leading is based on its arrival point. So let's say you play the beginning of the prelude, and you say, oh, I stopped at the subdominant because it's subdominant. Oh, the dominant, but with the leading tone creates a dissonance. I have to go to the resolution, back to the tonic. So I did 1, 4, 5, 1. And then I explore the major degrees, and I mean the relative. So you can sort of like subdivide it to small departures and stops. And more or less slow tempo, more or less elaborate, more or less trilled and delayed and expressed, but always by small, sort of small waves. And then the fugue very often, more than the prelude, but the prelude could also do that, has to have almost the analogy in my teaching of the aqueduct of the Romans, speaking of Latin, that has this very small percentage denivellation that continuously triggers the water that comes from the source to the city, so they can have water for bath and for drinking and all. Without this, they don't have a city. And they were the ones to create these architectural marvels, architectural bridges on not rivers, but really on every possible topography of terrain, in order to bring the water on top of it continuously, almost seamlessly dropping, but trickling until it arrives in the city. And so I would say that when you start the fugue, you try to maintain this lake surface mirror that you feel is constantly bringing you to further place without the necessity of climax and tension release. There are some, but each of these arrival points leads to the next. So every time you play it, you have to think, where does, in the further distance, sort of horizon line, mind-wandering, direction line, magnetic appeal. And so you can say, and only here drop the tension with a slight diminuendo rather than ritenuto. Which could also be considered not, because it ends on the third. He has an ending at the end of the first page on the other degree with the tonic of it on the melody. But when you have the fifth in the opening or the third, you sort of remain more open than conclusive. But that is arguable. I mean, you can decide that you want or and then the more you go further in the stretch of the original departure for its first punctuation, you organize your sentences and you organize your the rhythm of your speech and the organization of your thought process and the tension of the expectation of the verb compared to the placement of the subject. In German, the verb comes after the subject, could be another reason for this, like suspension, expecting to know if the action is present, past, or future. But even if you don't have that organization of the grammar, the rhetoric is to do with the attention span exposed, not only mentally, of course, too, intellectually. Essentially, it's seductive intellectually. Some people are more seduced by the intellect, like for a fugue, rather than the emotion purely so of an aria. But the expression of different levels of emotion, let's put it this way, comes also from that delayed tactics. And if you express yourself in a run-on sentence, the listener is hooked to listen to you perhaps more attentively than if you speak always in the same group of words, so to say. And I think the rhetoric is not indicated in the score. It's up to you, and you could argue that the length of sound determines it, the acoustic, the instrument, possibly. But I think it's really first how you read it, how you heard it from the score, from the silence of your connection to the essence of what the piece is, which is a notation, is perfectly imperfect, is definingly detailed, is allowing so much room for spaces between the interstices. I mean, that's all what we have to is teacher and student. We face that score and we wonder, what did he want? How did he want it? Before the metronome, after the metronome, the determination of the tempo because of the meter or because of the values or the rhythm or because of existence of similarities in other genres. How did he write a cantata, a mass, or Bach or Beethoven a quartet and a symphony compared to the sonata, or Mozart an opera compared to, let's say, a piano trio, and Haydn quartet compared to symphony? And so we can determine which instrument mirrors which genre mirrors which, in which repertoire you can explore this or that, more or less. I mean, you develop that knowledge. First is intuition. You just feel it. You don't know why. And then you go to school for years until you know to explain why your intuition led you to say that. And sometimes you find ways to play non-intuitive or counterintuitive in order to prove that you're more scholar than just intuitive, let's say, popular musician in the sense of popular music in the oral transmission of folkloric music, which you know how to sing it and play it from, let's say, ancestral tradition, but you don't know how to notate it. And then when you notate it, you sort of freeze it, and that then tradition is lost with the time passing. And then in the next generations, as we are, we try to reconnect to the meanings of the ecosystem of their time. And we don't have that capacity because we don't think like them, we don't pray like them, we don't dream like them, and we don't live in their time capsule, but we just extract their thought process in a theater play or a philosophic statement or beauty of a choice of a word, musically so, in a poem, by the word itself, in the given language that we learn to love, and it becomes its own meaning rather than only the meaning it vehicles, because after all, words are beautiful also by their sounds. For the meaning, when you choose one among another, it's like the synonymous is not just to not mention this obvious word or this, or to use the obvious word, but la note choisie, as the French call it, the chosen note. Why this? So you have an escaped and not ascending arpeggio. And reach each time the point, but then, and how do you express it? And if you do too much of these droppings, then you don't have that long line that I was speaking about. You want to construct as if it was just one note on different harmonization, but then it's different harmonization on different notes, which imply sometimes the leap that reaches its point or the leap that defects from the point is like an escaped. All these things we don't name, speak, and whatever we heard in the silence of our psyche from the score that we could more or less miss or understand until we fully decode it, like an art historian explaining a painting or a literature teacher who makes you understand all the sub-meanings that exist in a famous text or in a text that you're studying, and you start learning how to hear, read, therefore understand other meanings than what is obvious, creating therefore in you a capacity of critical thinking, which you can apply as an interpretation choice. As a pianist, beyond the fact of addressing teachers, recordings, YouTube University recordings of CDs, or friends or fellow students playing the same piece and having ideas. Oh, that's how I like to hear it. Or just, I don't like it like that. I really don't think it is so slow or too fast. And then it evolves as a pattern in your life journey, and you say, oh my God, really, I don't need to play so slow that after all. I can just be very calm without to be slow, and I can be meaningful without, and driven without to be fast, or overly fast. And what is the prestissimo in 109? Is it? And if it was tuned, and if it's shorter decay, and then the ascending fifth in Beethoven, in Bach, they're all the same elemental factors of these intervals. The leap of a fifth is a leap of the fifth. It happens to be even the same key. So it can become easily confusing because we deal with so many styles compared to them who studied and composed and lived within their own style, but they didn't even know it was the case, because it's like we live on Earth and we don't live on Mars. We can dream of it, but we don't yet. So in any case, outside of the daydreaming, we are here. Therefore, they were in their time frame, and I don't know that they would imagine we would still play them, study them, try to understand what they meant or suggested in the interstices of the notation, meaning in the unwritten, in the suggested, the between the lines. And sometimes we overestimate or overthink that there is irony in this sadness because in fact there wasn't, or there is, and then we want to think it was. So it's in the eye of the beholder, and we end up by playing pieces with our interpretation as an oeuvre over the oeuvre itself, like as if the interpretation is a piece that you add on the piece that you perform, and it becomes sort of like binom, the interpretation or the performer and the composition of the composer, often dead, to whom we attribute all the expression, all the intention, all the fact that today we can express it better, or perhaps more than he or she wanted it, could wanted it, have wanted it rather, if ever I could speak without confusing the terms of the tenses of the verbs. Music is my language more easily than words, but I tried because I wanted to convey that when you study music, you should always return to the original love for it and try to forget, like politeness, after you learn the good manners, they become part of your behaving, but not because of wanting to be polite, but through the politeness you live in society. So the voices work with each other because they're polite with each other. Sometimes they're expressively audacious with leaps. It's like playing a society and seeing personalities and characters in each voice, and not just sounds, colors, which they are, but not only. They should convey something that you don't want to put in words, not to belittle it. And let your direction of the line chase for distance, horizons, arrival points, and then we start. And there is no final truth, because you can change mind as the pieces are good companions of your life music trip. And you're welcome to contradict yourself as a teacher or as a performer, as a human, and not be locked to pedantic securities, which in fact are insecurities, and open to other people's playing. Say, oh, they do like this. I never heard this here. like philosophers answering with a question, I would like to conclude today's meeting with a dominant question. Thank you.